In October of 2019, the world watched a military parade roll through Tiananmen Square, and buried inside that procession was a missile that Amerikansky analysts had only seen in blurry satellite photos before. It was long, sleek, and mounted on a launcher unlike anything the People's Liberation Army had shown publicly. Within hours, Pentagon officials were fielding calls asking the same question. Could this thing actually hit a moving aircraft carrier from 2,000 miles away? 6 years later, that question isn't theoretical anymore, and the answer is reshaping how every navy on Earth thinks about the Pacific Ocean. China now fields a missile arsenal that didn't exist in any serious form 15 years ago. Hypersonic glide vehicles that dodge radar by changing direction mid-flight. Anti-ship ballistic missiles built specifically to sink the most expensive warships America has ever built. Intercontinental weapons that can reach any city on the planet in under 30 minutes. And it's not just the hardware. It's the sheer number of these systems, produced faster than American shipyards, can build the ships meant to counter them. This isn't a story about one weapon. It's about an entire generation of missile technology that emerged almost overnight, and what it means for a military balance that's held steady in the Pacific since the end of World War II. To understand why defense officials in Washington are losing sleep over this, we need to go back to a moment when China's military was, by most accounts, a joke. Rewind to 1996. Tensions were boiling over between China and Taiwan after Taiwanese President Lee Teng-hui made a trip to the United States, a visit Beijing viewed as a dangerous nod toward Taiwanese independence. China responded by firing missiles into waters near Taiwan, a show of force meant to intimidate voters ahead of the island's presidential election. The United States responded by sending 2 aircraft carrier battle groups into the region, a blunt reminder of who actually controlled the seas. China had no answer. Its military watched 2 American carriers sail through the strait, and there was nothing they could do about it except watch. For the Chinese Communist Party, this humiliation became a turning point. Not a footnote in a history book, but the single event that launched what would become the most aggressive missile development program in modern history. The lesson Beijing took from 1996 was simple and brutal. As long as America could sail carriers wherever it wanted in the Pacific without consequence, China would never be able to enforce its claims over Taiwan, the South China Sea, or anywhere else it considered its own backyard. So Chinese military planners set out to build something no one had built before, a way to make the ocean itself dangerous for American ships, without needing a navy that could match the US fleet for fleet. It's worth understanding just how far behind China actually was at that point in time. Throughout the 1990s, the People's Liberation Army was still largely equipped with weapons based on Soviet designs from decades earlier. Its Air Force flew variants of fighter jets that were already considered outdated by NATO standards. Its Navy consisted mostly of coastal patrol vessels and aging destroyers, nothing capable of projecting serious power beyond China's immediate shoreline. The gap between what America could deploy and what China could deploy wasn't measured in years. It was measured in generations of technology. Some Chinese officers who lived through that humiliation later became the generals who oversaw the missile program decades afterward, carrying the memory of watching American ships sail past unchallenged into every budget meeting and every design review that followed. This is where the story of the DF-21D begins, though it would take over a decade before the world understood what China was actually building. Through the early 2000s, satellite imagery occasionally caught glimpses of new missile testing facilities in the Gobi Desert. Analysts noted strange mock-ups shaped like ship decks, sometimes hundreds of feet long, built out in the middle of nowhere. Nobody quite understood why China would build full-scale replicas of aircraft carriers in a desert, until the pieces started coming together. China wasn't testing missiles against static targets. It was testing whether it could hit a moving one. By 2010, U.S. military officials were referring to the DF-21D by an unofficial nickname that stuck instantly: the carrier killer. The concept behind it was almost elegant in its simplicity. Instead of building a navy expensive enough to sink American carriers ship to ship, which would take decades and trillions of dollars, China built a missile that could be launched from land, travel over 1,000 miles, then descend from the edge of space and strike a moving aircraft carrier with enough precision to disable it. The math behind this was terrifying for American planners. A single Nimitz-class carrier costs roughly $13 billion to build and carries a crew of over 5,000 sailors. The DF-21D, by contrast, costs a fraction of that, and China could produce dozens of them for the price of a single American warship. If even one or two missiles got through, it would represent one of the worst naval disasters in American history, comparable to Pearl Harbor, except with modern casualty counts and modern political consequences. But building a missile that can theoretically hit a moving ship and actually hitting one are very different problems. A carrier moving at 30 knots isn't sitting still, waiting to get hit. It has escort ships bristling with interceptor missiles. It has electronic warfare systems designed to jam guidance signals. The entire concept depended on a level of precision guidance and terminal maneuvering that most military analysts doubted China could pull off. That's when the second piece of the puzzle appeared, and this one changed the equation entirely. In 2019, alongside that parade in Beijing, China revealed the DF-17. Unlike a traditional ballistic missile that follows a predictable arc through the atmosphere like a thrown baseball, the DF-17 carries something called a hypersonic glide vehicle. After the missile launches and reaches the edge of space, this glide vehicle detaches and skips along the upper atmosphere at speeds exceeding Mach 5, all while maneuvering unpredictably from side to side. Traditional missile defense systems work by calculating a predictable trajectory and launching an interceptor to meet the incoming warhead at a specific point in space. It's essentially advanced geometry, and it works reasonably well against missiles that follow physics-predictable arcs. But a hypersonic glide vehicle breaks that math completely. Because it can change direction mid-flight, defense systems can't calculate where it's going to be. By the time an interceptor missile adjusts its course, the glide vehicle has already moved somewhere else. American defense officials who reviewed early intelligence on the DF-17 reportedly described the technology as roughly a decade ahead of anything the United States had operational at the time. That's not a small gap in military technology. That's the kind of gap that changes the outcome of wars before they even start. There's a story that circulated among defense circles about a 2021 test that reportedly stunned American intelligence agencies. According to reporting at the time, China launched a hypersonic vehicle that circled the entire globe in low orbit before releasing a glide vehicle that maneuvered toward its target. General John Hyten, then vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, later said publicly that the test came close to what he described as a Sputnik moment, a reference to the shock that rippled through America when the Soviet Union launched the first satellite in 1957. When a senior American general starts comparing your missile test to the event that kicked off the entire space race, that tells you something about how seriously the Pentagon was taking these developments. Combine the reach and payload of the DF-21D concept with the maneuverability of DF-17-style glide vehicles, and you get something the U.S. Navy has publicly admitted it doesn't have a reliable defense against. Not difficult to defend against, not expensive to defend against. Current American missile defense systems, including the Aegis combat system and standard missile interceptors deployed across the Pacific Fleet, were not designed with hypersonic maneuvering targets in mind. This is the part where the story usually gets reduced to China-built scary missiles, and that's true, but it misses the strategic genius, or the strategic danger, depending on which side of the Pacific you're standing on. China didn't need to build an aircraft carrier fleet to match America's 11 carriers. It built something that makes American carriers too dangerous to sail into contested waters in the first place. Military strategists call this anti-access, area denial, or A2AD for short, and it's arguably the most successful asymmetric military strategy of the last 30 years. Here's what that actually means in practice. If a conflict broke out over Taiwan tomorrow, American military planners would face an agonizing decision. Do you sail carrier strike groups into the Taiwan Strait or the South China Sea, knowing that Chinese missile batteries along the coast could theoretically target them from over 1,000 miles inland, using weapons that current defense systems can't reliably stop? Or do you keep those carriers further back, outside the effective range of China's missile umbrella, which means they're too far away to actually project the air power that makes them valuable in the first place? Either choice is a loss. Sail in close, and you're risking the most expensive and politically catastrophic loss the U.S. military could suffer. Stay back, and you've effectively ceded the waters around Taiwan to China without firing a shot. This is the trap China spent 25 years building, ever since that humiliating moment in 1996, when American carriers sailed through the strait unopposed. But the missile story doesn't stop at anti-ship weapons. While the DF-21D and DF-17 were built to keep American ships out of the Pacific, China was simultaneously building something meant to make sure that even if a full-scale war broke out, the United States mainland itself would never feel safe. Enter the DF-41, China's newest and most powerful intercontinental ballistic missile. The DF-41 has a range estimated at over 9,300 miles, which means it can reach anywhere in the continental United States from launch sites deep inside Chinese territory. It's road mobile, meaning it can be driven around on massive transporter trucks and hidden in tunnels, forests, or mountain facilities, making it nearly impossible for American satellites to track and target before launch. And here's the detail that genuinely worries strategic planners. The DF-41 is believed to carry multiple independently targetable re-entry vehicles, or MIRVs, meaning a single missile can deploy up to 10 separate nuclear warheads, each one capable of striking a different target. Do the math on that for a second. If China has, conservatively, somewhere between 200 and 300 DF-41 missiles, and each one carries up to 10 warheads, that's potentially thousands of individual nuclear targets that could be struck from an arsenal that most Western analysts assumed, as recently as 2018, was a fraction of that size. This actually connects to one of the more startling revelations of the past few years. In 2021, commercial satellite imagery analysts identified over 120 new missile silo construction sites in the Chinese desert near Yumen in Gansu province. Then more were found near Hami in Xinjiang. Then more near Ordos in Inner Mongolia. Total estimates eventually crossed 350 new silos under construction, spread across multiple sites, all discovered within about a 2-year window. For context, the United States currently operates around 450 Minuteman III silos total, a number that's stayed essentially frozen since the 1970s. China went from having a nuclear arsenal that most experts estimated at around 200 warheads total to potentially tripling or quadrupling that number within the span of a single decade. The Pentagon's own 2023 report to Congress estimated China could possess over 1,500 nuclear warheads by 2035, a number that would put it roughly on par with current American and Russian stockpiles, arsenals that took the Cold War's full 45 years to build. This is the part of the story that doesn't get talked about enough. For decades, the entire logic of nuclear deterrence rested on a fairly simple, if grim, framework. There were two major nuclear powers, the United States and Russia, both possessing roughly comparable arsenals large enough to guarantee mutual destruction if either one launched first. China was always the smaller player in this equation, maintaining what strategists called a minimum deterrent. Just enough weapons to guarantee it could strike back if attacked, but not enough to compete directly with the two superpowers. That framework is now obsolete. With China rapidly expanding toward arsenal parity with the US and Russia, you no longer have a two-player nuclear standoff. You have three roughly comparable nuclear powers, and the mathematics of deterrence get exponentially more complicated with 3 players instead of 2. Arms control agreements that took decades to negotiate between Washington and Moscow never accounted for a scenario where Beijing needed to be part of the conversation too. And right now, China has shown zero interest in joining any trilateral arms control framework. So why is China doing this now? Why the sudden acceleration after decades of restraint? Part of the answer connects back to Taiwan. Chinese military doctrine has increasingly focused on what analysts call reunification by 2027, a target date that keeps appearing in leaked intelligence assessments and public statements from Chinese military officials, though Beijing has never officially confirmed it as a hard deadline. Whether or not 2027 is a real target, the missile buildup lines up suspiciously well with a military planning window that would give China overwhelming regional dominance in the Taiwan Strait within the next few years. Part of the answer is also about deterring American intervention more broadly. If China's missile arsenal makes any American military response to a Taiwan invasion prohibitively costly, whether through anti-ship missiles, threatening carriers, or an expanded nuclear arsenal raising the stakes of any escalation, then China gains enormous strategic flexibility. It doesn't need to actually use these weapons. It just needs American planners to believe using them is credible, which changes every calculation about what the US is willing to risk. And part of the answer is simpler than geopolitics. China has the industrial capacity to do this at a scale the United States genuinely struggles to match. American defense manufacturing has consolidated dramatically since the Cold War. There used to be more than a dozen major shipbuilders capable of constructing naval vessels. Today, there are effectively 2. Missile production faces similar bottlenecks, with supply chains for certain components stretching back years, not months. China, by contrast, has spent the last 2 decades building the largest manufacturing base in human history, and turning that industrial machine toward missile production means output numbers that American defense contractors simply can't match without years of retooling and billions in new investment. This is where the story shifts from China built impressive weapons to China built weapons faster than America can respond to them, which is arguably the more important half of this entire situation. The US Navy currently has roughly 300 combat vessels. Naval planners have repeatedly stated they'd like that number closer to 350 or even 400 to meet global commitments. But American shipyards are so backlogged that even simple maintenance schedules for existing submarines have slipped by years in some cases. Meanwhile, China's Navy, by raw ship count, is already the largest in the world, having surpassed the US Navy in total vessel numbers back around 2020. American ships tend to be larger and more capable individually, but the gap is closing, and it's closing specifically because China's shipyards can turn out new vessels at a pace American shipyards haven't matched since World War II. This industrial gap matters just as much for missiles as it does for ships. Producing a DF-17 or DF-41 requires precision manufacturing, specialized propellant production, and guidance systems that used to be exclusively American or Russian expertise. China has spent enormous resources over the past 2 decades building domestic capability in exactly these areas, partly through legitimate research, partly, according to numerous American intelligence assessments, through industrial espionage, targeting defense contractors and research universities. Whatever the mix of legitimate development and stolen technology, the result is the same. China can now produce advanced missile systems at a rate that outpaces anything the Pentagon currently has planned in its own procurement pipeline. Some defense analysts have pointed out an uncomfortable truth. In a prolonged conflict where both sides were expending munitions rapidly, China's production capacity might allow it to simply outproduce American missile stockpiles over time, even if American individual missiles remained more advanced on a unit-by-unit basis. Now, It's worth pausing here and addressing something that gets lost in a lot of coverage of this topic. None of this guarantees China would win a conflict with the United States. Untested weapons systems often perform very differently in actual combat than they do in testing environments. The DF-21D has never been used against a real moving carrier in an actual war. Hypersonic glide vehicles have never faced a fully alerted, combat-ready American carrier strike group actively employing every countermeasure at its disposal. There's a massive difference between a missile hitting a stationary target in the Gobi Desert during a controlled test and hitting a maneuvering ship surrounded by escort vessels, firing interceptors, and jamming signals in real time. American military officials, even while acknowledging the seriousness of China's missile advances, have pushed back against narratives suggesting American carriers are now obsolete or defenseless. The Navy has invested heavily in its own countermeasures, including upgraded Aegis systems. The SM-6 interceptor, designed specifically with some anti-hypersonic capability in mind, and electronic warfare systems meant to disrupt missile guidance before impact. There's also the layered defense concept, where a carrier group isn't relying on just one system to stop an incoming missile, but multiple overlapping systems that each have a chance to intercept before impact. But here's the uncomfortable reality underneath all of that reassurance. Even American officials who push back on the carriers are obsolete narrative generally stop short of saying current defenses are fully reliable against a coordinated hypersonic missile strike. The honest assessment from most defense analysts sits somewhere in the middle. American carriers probably aren't sitting ducks, but sailing them deep into the range of China's coastal missile batteries during an actual conflict would involve risk levels the U.S. Navy hasn't faced since World War II, given how much more destructive a single successful hit would be with modern warheads compared to anything used against ships 80 years ago. This uncertainty is, in some ways, the entire point of China's strategy. Deterrence doesn't require certainty. It requires enough doubt that the other side becomes hesitant to act. If American military planners aren't 100% confident their carriers can safely operate near Taiwan during a crisis, that hesitation alone changes the calculus, even if the missiles never actually get fired. There's another dimension to this story that often gets overlooked in the focus on hardware. China's missile developments aren't happening in isolation. They're part of a broader military modernization that includes stealth fighters like the J-20, a rapidly expanding Navy, cyber warfare capabilities, and space-based systems designed to target American satellites that the U.S. military relies on for communication and navigation. The missiles are the most visible and dramatic piece of this puzzle, but they're one piece of a much larger effort to build what Chinese military doctrine calls informationized warfare capability, essentially a military built for the conditions of a modern, technology-saturated battlefield rather than the industrial-scale warfare of the 20th century. This shift hasn't gone unnoticed in Washington. The 2022 National Defense Strategy, for the first time in decades, explicitly named China, rather than terrorism or Russia, as the pacing challenge for American military planning. For 20 years, following September 11th, American defense spending and doctrine were built around counterterrorism and irregular warfare against non-state actors. China's missile buildup, among other factors, forced a pivot back toward what strategists call great power competition, planning for a potential conflict against a peer or near-peer military, something the Pentagon hadn't seriously planned for since the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. That pivot has led to real, tangible changes. The AUKUS agreement between Australia, the United Kingdom, and the United States, announced in 2021, centers heavily around providing Australia with nuclear-powered submarines specifically to help counter Chinese naval expansion in the Pacific. the United States has expanded its military presence and rotational deployments across the Philippines, reversing years of reduced American footprint in the region. Japan, traditionally constrained by post-World War II pacifist constitutional provisions, has begun the largest military buildup in its modern history, explicitly citing Chinese missile capabilities as a primary driver. Taiwan itself has responded by dramatically increasing defense spending and adopting what's sometimes called a porcupine strategy, essentially making any invasion so costly through distributed, hard-to-target defensive systems that China would think twice before attempting it, even with missile superiority. This includes investments in mobile anti-ship missile batteries, extensive mining of potential invasion beaches, and dispersed air defense systems designed to survive an initial missile barrage rather than being wiped out in a first strike. South Korea has quietly followed a similar path, expanding its own missile programs and investing heavily in the THAAD missile defense system, a decision that has repeatedly strained relations with Beijing, which views the system as a direct threat to its own strategic missile capabilities in the region. Even countries that don't share a border with China, like the Philippines and Vietnam, have started rethinking their defense postures, quietly courting closer military cooperation with Washington while trying not to provoke Beijing too openly. All of this represents a genuine arms race unfolding in real time across the Pacific, and missiles are the technology driving most of the anxiety behind it. Every new silo discovered in the Chinese desert, every new hypersonic test, every parade revealing another unfamiliar weapon system, triggers another round of budget requests, strategic reassessments, and diplomatic tension. So, where does this actually leave things? What happens next? The honest answer is that nobody knows for certain, and anyone claiming complete confidence about how a potential conflict would unfold is overselling their expertise. What we do know is that the strategic balance in the Pacific looks fundamentally different today than it did even 10 years ago. The assumption that American naval power could operate with near impunity anywhere in the Western Pacific, an assumption that held from the end of World War II through the early 2000s, no longer holds the way it used to. China's missile arsenal has effectively purchased something extremely valuable with a fraction of the cost of building a rival blue water navy: doubt. Doubt in the minds of American military planners about whether carriers can operate safely near Chinese shores. Doubt in the minds of allies about whether American security guarantees remain as ironclad as they once were. Doubt in the broader international community about whether the post-World War II order, built around uncontested American naval dominance, can survive another few decades unchanged. Some analysts argue this doubt itself is the danger, more than any specific missile system. Miscalculation becomes far more likely when both sides aren't entirely certain what the other can actually do in a real conflict, versus what looks impressive in a test or a parade. History is full of examples where uncertainty about relative military strength led directly to catastrophic wars that neither side fully intended, from World War I's tangled alliance system to the outbreak of the Korean War, where both sides badly misjudged what the other was willing and able to do. There's a particular irony worth sitting with here, too. The same industrial base that built China's economic rise, the factories, the supply chains, the manufacturing expertise that turned it into the workshop of the world, is now the exact same machinery producing missiles that threaten to unravel the trade relationships responsible for that rise in the first place. China's economy and America's economy remain deeply intertwined despite everything happening on the military side. Trade between the two countries still totals hundreds of billions of dollars a year, even as both sides prepare, quietly and not so quietly, for a scenario where that relationship could break down entirely. What's clear is that the missiles paraded through Beijing in 2019, and the hundreds more built quietly in factories and tested in deserts since then, have changed something fundamental about how military power works in the 21st century. You no longer need to match a superpower ship for ship or plane for plane to challenge its dominance in a region. You need the right combination of missiles, precision, and industrial capacity to to make that superpower's most expensive assets too risky to use. China figured that out, starting from the humiliation of 1996, and spent nearly 3 decades quietly building the answer. Whether that answer ever gets tested in an actual conflict is, hopefully, a question that remains permanently theoretical. But the fact that American, Japanese, Taiwanese, and Australian military planners now have to seriously game out scenarios where the answer isn't theoretical anymore, that alone tells you everything about how much the world has already changed. If this kind of deep dive into the technology and strategy shaping global power shifts is something you want more of, subscribe and turn on notifications, because these stories are only going to get more relevant in the years ahead, not less.